All right, everybody. Welcome to Thursday's class session. Today we are going to go over trees and construction with Graham. Before we get started, we have a few reminders and a few announcements. So looking at this schedule, after today, we only have 4 classes left. Now, Graham has some information to share on class 11 and class 12, which is going to be very important for you to hear.
Yeah, for those 2 chapters, we're bringing in Rob Dean, really accomplished climber and trainer in the area. And Rob's got a lot of great experience to share, and it would be very easy for us to get off track with sharing information that's a little less relevant to the ISA exam, but really good practical job skill knowledge. So in order to stay on target, we're gonna structure those 2 sessions, 11 and 12, around the ISA questions themselves. We're gonna kick off right away with all that content. And then after we go through those chapter questions for chapters 15 and 16, then we'll use whatever time we have left to get some of that other great wisdom that Rob has to share. So please, especially if you're testing, review those 2 chapters well and know which questions and which content from those chapters you really need to expand on a little bit so that we can have Rob do that, because we'll be moving through the questions themselves one at a time. And then with whatever time we have left, like I said, we'll get into some of the other things that aren't specific to the ISA study guide and the exam. So in preparation for that last week, just kind of be really aware of what kind of questions you have over that material.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Graham.
Yeah.
So with that, of course, that obviously, so we will be done in 4 weeks, which does not leave a whole lot of time for you to start your application if you have not started your application. We have been reminding you about this since last week, and the reason being, we finally have a statement that we can release to you. We don't have all of the details sorted out yet. However, we are expecting to have financial assistance available for testing and are finalizing the details of this. We suggest that folks go ahead and fill out their ISA or NAA application so that they are approved and can take advantage of the financial assistance when the program is released. Our ultimate goal is to have this sorted and organized and ready to go before the end of the session, the series. However, you will have to have an approval letter to be able to qualify for that financial assistance. As everything develops and we have more information, we will be sure to release that out probably via email, same way that we've been sending the link information. Otherwise, we are still looking into opportunities for in-person exams. Right now, it's not looking like a real ideal opportunity for us to have a proctor host an exam on our behalf. However, there are other proctors in the state that we are reaching out to, and it will be at their own discretion if they will host an in-person exam or not. So as we learn more information about that, we will also keep you posted. So again, if you have not started your application, please send me or Graham an email so that way we can get you going and get that process done as soon as possible. Now, I want to make this very clear. Once you are approved, do not schedule or pay for your exam until we have the financial assistance sorted out, because likely it'll be some form that you will apply at the time of your checkout. And so just get to the point that you have that letter of approval, so that way you will be ready to submit your application for that financial assistance. That is all I have.
Yeah. The ISA application will ask you for a time frame you're intending to test, and that's not a hard and fast date that you must test. It's just sort of prompting the question of when you're planning to do it generally. So don't get too mired in what's the date. I don't have a date. I'm not sure. We're, looking at that late March, early April window, but the application itself will take a little time to get the documentation on your work experience together. And then it's usually, I think ISA's official answer is that it's about a 5-day turnaround to review that and get an answer back.
Right.
NAA is probably a similar time frame, probably a little bit faster. So it's just going to take some time for the whole process and for you to get that approval back. And so we really want to be sure that everyone that wants to test is locked and loaded and ready to sit for that exam while everything's still fresh in your head from the workshop series.
Right. So just for anybody who came in a little bit late, we've just announced that we are working on an opportunity to provide financial assistance, and you will absolutely have to have your approval letter from either ISA or NAA to sit for their exam to qualify for that assistance. We will keep everybody updated and posted via email. And again, like Graham said, when you set up your ISA, initially they just want a general idea. So you can just say like April 1, 2021. So, and then when you actually schedule it, and you can change it from a computer-based to a in-person exam. They're pretty flexible about that. Their system just asks you to check it. So if you check one now and then change your mind later because another opportunity comes up, I don't think that's going to be an issue with them. So those are all things to keep in mind.
Yep. More long-term though, we are figuring out the exam proctoring situation so that we have some options for folks in whatever corner of the state that you're in. So it's been hard to get all those details together in the time frame that we're trying to work on for this workshop series, but know that we'll be working on streamlining that process for everybody down the road. So with that, we'll get into what we do to protect trees during construction projects. This is going to build on some concepts that we've already talked about quite a bit in the series. A lot to do with soil, some to do with damage and pruning and the physiological responses that trees have to damage. So we'll get into it. Construction certainly can be deadly for trees. There's a number of ways that happens both above and below ground. And usually the biggest concern is for well-established trees that are adjacent or within construction project scope, because these trees have done a lot of growing over the years. On the right-hand side with these roots, there's a lot of stored energy that the tree has produced over the years that it is lost along with those roots. And so younger trees are in some ways less likely to be impacted the way that really well-established trees are that have expansive root systems that are going to sustain more damage potentially. So a brief overview on soil properties as it relates to this construction. Chrissy, I think you were the one that talked about soils earlier in the series, and
Yes.
you talked about macro and micro pores. As the name implies, of course, the macro pores are the larger ones that are not going to be able to hold moisture in place, and then the micro pores where the surface tension of water is going to adhere and fill that void better than something that a space that's larger and water is going to want to drain away from. So it's worth reiterating that a typical soil is only 50% actual matter and 50% open pore space that's either going to hold water or facilitate gas exchange. When we talk about soil saturation, that's the point where a soil is so full of water that it is freely draining out. Whereas with field capacity, we've reached an equilibrium of that soil where where every micropore is charged with water and is holding on to it, and it's not percolating by gravity deeper into the soil profile. So field capacity is where at the optimal amount of water that the soil is able to hold without it draining down further. Permanent wilting point, referring to a state when the soil is completely bone dry. This is where we have not only huge cracks in the soil usually, but also aggregates that are very hard to break up. If anybody has seen a air spade demonstration, we always want to ensure that we have good soil moisture in place before we do those excavations, for partially for this reason, because that soil is not going to be blown free by compressed air when we're at that permanent wilting point or a really dry soil. So what does this have to do with construction? Well, there's lots of heavy equipment and materials in play, and they are going to act to compact the soil, of course. And as we've talked about a couple times throughout the series, the ability of a soil to move gas through it and provide more as it's used by the tree is huge for the long-term viability of that tree. So if we have an undisturbed soil that we're starting to compact, then that's going to inhibit that gas exchange and diminish the quantity of those macro pores. The larger pores are, of course, the easier ones to smush down into smaller size. Micropores are impacted as well, but not to the same degree. And that compaction is exacerbated even further when the soil is particularly moist. So although we want, for the tree's sake, to have good soil moisture in place, if we are going to have to bring heavy equipment and materials across an area, from a compaction standpoint, it's much better that we have a soil on the drier side. Another point to make is that 80% of soil compaction occurs on the very first pass of that equipment. So when there's discussion about paths through a construction site to move materials, sometimes contractors will say, well, we really just need the Bobcat to take this one big heavy thing over there and we'll be in and out and done. But a lot, if not most, the majority of that compaction is going to occur on that very first pass. So it's important for us not to be talked into allowing that sort of thing if there's an alternative to even a single pass of that equipment going across a piece of ground that's going to impact trees. So another quick review on physiology is where roots typically grow, of course, in that top 24 inches, most of the fine feeder roots being concentrated in that top 8 to 12 inches even. The analogy of a wine glass on a dinner plate works really well for this. I'm repeating myself a little bit there, but the dinner plate, of course, is the root system of the tree that's very wide and not as deep as we often tend to picture them. And then the stem of the wine glass being the trunk of the tree and the bowl of the wine glass being the canopy. So what are the functions of roots? We've got time, so maybe if someone wants to unmute and give a take on what roots are all about. I don't have to be the one giving all the answers here. What do you guys think roots are for?
Go ahead, unmute yourself. Graham's going to be very discussion today.
Yeah.
They have lots of things they can. One is for support, storage, and the fine feeder roots take in water and nutrients.
Right, right. So with those two primary types of roots, there are more than two types of roots, but mostly we're looking at, as Mariana mentioned, those larger roots serving the role of providing structure and support for the tree, as well as storage of energy. but they're not really, those larger roots are not doing a lot of uptake of nutrients and water because of their size. They're more the pathways, the highways that all these smaller roots are leading towards to move that material, that the water and nutrients up into the tree to keep it alive and keep its processes going. And then those fine feeder roots also have smaller root hairs in some, and that's species specific a little bit. But fine feeder roots and root hairs are prospecting for that nutrition and that moisture that they need. And they're also growing impulses that die back over time. Not all roots that a tree grows are intended to be in the ground permanently. Some of them are annual in nature, and they're grown and then they die back over time. And that is one of the mechanisms that produces organic matter in the soil, aside from leaf litter and that sort of thing falling on the surface of the ground and breaking down over time. Thank you, Mariana. Why do roots grow where they do? Why aren't they growing really deep? Can someone else give me a little bit on what's going on there? Why did the root system look like this?
That's where the nutrients are, and that's where the oxygen is.
Yeah,
And they need both of those.
exactly, Kent. We had a question last week about shallow roots. No, it was just Tuesday. I'm sorry. It was for a different presentation I did. And someone was asking about surface roots. Can we cover those with soil when we have a really shallow rooted tree? And we certainly don't want to be putting excessive amounts of soil around surface roots if it's going to bury the tree deeper, because it does have some roots that are a little bit deeper, and those will be now even further below in the soil profile if we add a lot of grade on top. So I much prefer that we expand the mulch area, the circle of that mulch for the tree, and take those roots out of the equation in terms of mowing equipment causing chronic damage to those roots week after week that can allow decay to spread through the root system. So roots are growing in that top surface because that's where the action is. And if we're over irrigating turf grass so that we keep it nice and lush and green all year, 2, 3, 4 times a week, then that is saturating the soil and diminishing the gas exchange in the soil, so that the tree's roots are tending to be right up in the top where the gas exchange is still desirable. So they're not growing near the surface because they love all the water. They're doing it to escape the lack of gas exchange deeper in the soil profile usually. There are some trees that are common offenders of being shallow rooted just by the fact that they are the species that they are. But generally speaking, if we see shallow rooted trees, it's often something that's been encouraged for the tree to do through the management practices on the site. So those roots are in the top 6 inch to 2 feet of soil. These root systems are really expansive and growing far out beyond the drip line itself of the tree in order to provide that stability. That dinner plate does a much better job of keeping the tree upright than if that root system was going deep. So the functions of these roots, of course, are taking up all the water and the nutrition that they need and moving it into storage and keeping the tree upright, as Mariana shared with us. So we have the large woody roots and the feeder roots, both having their own separate functions and having different concerns for us in terms of impacting them. And then trees grow where there's water, oxygen, and minerals to be found. And when that soil aeration is less than optimal, they're going to go where they need to get the components that they need to keep living. With the COVID restrictions, I haven't been traveling a lot lately, of course. I need to go see what's going on down here. This photo is from Nebraska City, right off the highway that goes north and south through town as you get off of 75. And this is bur oak that we're seeing here. Bur oaks are one species within the genus of oak, and most oaks are not very tolerant of soil disturbance and poor soil aeration. So as soon as I drove past and saw this expansive construction project going on, a lot of grade change, a lot of fill dirt being added, I knew these were trees that were worth photographing now so that I could compare that to later. So I definitely need to get back down there again and do some follow-up photos. I wouldn't be surprised to find these trees gone. And it is only fair for me to mention that the contractor in this case may have fully intended for these trees to be removed at some point and isn't delusional about whether or not these trees are actually going to survive having this much soil deposited around their base. But just imagine what, multiple feet worth of backfill is going to do to the root system's ability to get the moisture and the oxygen and carbon dioxide that they need to continue to thrive. There was probably some of the dieback we see in the canopy was probably already in place, but certainly it will continue to get worse with all of this backfill in place. The weight of this fill soil itself is further compacting the ground that was the initial grade that the tree was growing in also. We can see evidence of how the tree is really not a happy camper. So there are a number of ways that we can minimize how much compaction is going to occur, because it's unrealistic to think that construction can be done without some sort of pathway for materials and heavy equipment to get from the street to where they need to go. So one thing that we can do is temporarily mulch a pathway really deeply. And we're talking about as much as a foot of wood chips for bobcats to drive on, in order to take the force that's pushing on the ground and spread it out and allow the mulch itself to compact before the soil itself below is impacted. Large plywood or sheets. I have steel sheets in here for some reason. I don't know that that's very feasible or effective, but the mulch and plywood are both pretty good temporary solutions for reducing how much compaction might occur. In more heavily trafficked sites, this is probably not so much a construction site, but a way in and out of a construction site. Old tires can be repurposed in a way like this to create that mat that will reduce how muddy the site is going to be and how much vehicles are going to track that mud in and out of the job site. And then as you see, they're all interwoven together with some steel cable in order to create a contiguous mat of multiple old tires. So kind of a creative repurposing of a waste product. Sometimes wood pathways are done. It's not always just 4x8 sheets of particle board, but actual dimensional lumber tied together to create sort of a temporary boardwalk for heavy equipment to drive on. This is a little bit newer to the industry, but there are anti-compaction pads that a person can purchase in order to bring equipment into a backyard to get some tree work done. And these probably have applications for construction sites as well. The limitation here is that these pads can be expensive and take up a lot of space on a bucket truck or whatever piece of equipment is going to the job site. And so it's going to be a little time consuming to lay out these pads, drive, 12, 15, 20 feet, and then take the pads from the back and bring them to the front. So it is a slow process in order to minimize that compaction. For bucket trucks themselves, for a long time now, we've been employing outrigger pads that reduce how much the outriggers on a bucket truck are going to push down on the soil with all the weight of the bucket truck, or not all of it, but a significant amount that's not being supported by the tires going in there. And in lots of cases, 1, 2, or 3 tires from the bucket truck are actually leaving the ground in order to get a solid base with the outriggers. So this is another way to address compaction for specific pieces of equipment that have those hydraulic outriggers that stabilize the crane or bucket truck. So during construction, there's a lot of damage that can occur to trees. Feeder roots can be crushed from heavy equipment. They're also going to, as the soil is compacted, feeder roots are also going to have a more difficult go at continuing to grow. Even if they're not crushed by the equipment itself, they're going to need to grow into newly compacted soil, and that's going to slow that process down of feeder roots establishing throughout as much soil volume as they're capable of. When we change the grade, then sometimes we're burying those tree roots and smothering them, as I mentioned earlier, impacting the gas exchange, impacting the water infiltration to where the root system is. If we're taking away soil, then of course we're changing the grade in the opposite direction, and that can expose roots to open air. This is more of an issue for those fine feeder roots than the larger woody lignified roots being exposed to air. They're going to be more tolerant of being exposed, but they will also be, of course, be damaged by whatever equipment is pulling that soil off of the roots. If they're exposed to the open air, it's because something scraped across them in order to get the soil off. Oftentimes there are utilities that need to be installed, and of course there are trenches that are going to impact root systems. So that everything along the route of that trench is going to be cut to the depth that the trench itself goes in order to get those utilities installed. The soil compaction is a no-brainer. We've hit on that a lot. There's also physical damage to above ground parts of the tree as well. Construction contractors love to park bobcats in the shade because in the summer months, they don't want to get into a hot cab in order to go to work for the day. And so they're going to really gravitate in some cases towards staging their equipment in the shade of trees. Because as we've talked about before, it's really nice to have that shade minimizing air temperatures, the reflected heat, all that sort of thing that we see as a benefit that trees provide is also a benefit for the folks that are working on the construction site. And so there are ways that we can limit and minimize how much of that heavy equipment and staged material ends up underneath the tree. And it's just natural that as you're driving a bobcat or something like that in and around trees, that sometimes you're going to run into the trunk and cause damage to it. It's hard to expect that to never happen. So it's much better to limit how much traffic is going to be in close proximity to the tree instead of expecting that everybody's going to drive close to those trees and never come in contact with them. One other thing that's also not considered very often is that when there is removal of trees in conjunction with a construction project, that can leave adjacent trees a little bit more susceptible to wind throw. When we have a big grouping of trees that have been growing close together in proximity, then they have adapted to lower wind speeds and wind forces than they'll be exposed to after some trees that are growing next to them have been taken out. So we're always on the lookout for those trees that are on the edge of a group of trees that has had others removed from it recently, because they have not had the exposure to that wind and the response wood that they would grow if they had been exposed to those wind forces. So they are definitely not adapted to the new wind situation that they're going to be in when their neighbors have been taken out already. This is a link to a really good article that Bartlett put together on sidewalk repair near trees. There are a number of creative solutions that are rarely considered and we really should be thinking about more when there is damage to a sidewalk in particular from trees. Because as we all know, when trees are planted at the proper depth, we have these buttress roots at the base, and these are eventually going to lift concrete if the concrete is close enough to be in conflict with what the root system's trying to do. So there is no law that I'm aware of that says that sidewalks have to be straight. We can redirect a sidewalk that's been damaged around the tree in order to avoid the conflict between the concrete and the root system of the tree entirely. Sometimes panels of concrete have been lifted, and with asphalt, we can reduce or eliminate tripping hazards by making a more gradual change up to that panel, as opposed to ripping it out entirely and trying to dig back down into the ground in order to get the proper grade in place to repair this panel and replace it. And of course, most cities have access to equipment that grinds concrete down. So if we have just one side of a panel that's been heaved a bit and we still have a significant thickness of concrete left, then we can grind that tripping hazard down rather than a more invasive approach of taking the whole panel out, like I mentioned before. So definitely check out that resource there if this is a situation that you think you'll encounter. How we feel about this? This tree gonna do well? Anybody? I dare you to tell me that it is. No, this is a disaster. And all my points about sidewalk repair remain, that there were alternatives to the sidewalk. Driveways are a little bit more of a challenge. There's only so much that we can reduce the width of that driveway and have the driveway still be effective. And property lines, of course, are going to come into play here as well. So sometimes the removal of the tree is really the only answer that there is when you have a driveway that just absolutely has to be repaired and there's just not enough space to accommodate adjusting where the footprint of the concrete actually will be when it's repaired. So what do we got in the chat? I'm sure some interesting comments about this photo. I bet the car turning in will still bump that tree trunk. Exactly. These are tree coffins of a sort. Whenever we have a pretty small tree lawn here between the curb and the sidewalk, then we're much better off putting a smaller a tree with a smaller mature size that's still going to be able to give us the clearance that we need for the street in order to be safe to be on the street. So the smaller the width of this space, the less likely we can successfully plant trees. If we have only 2 or 3 feet to deal with, then we don't have the adequate soil volume and space away from the concrete to grow a tree that's large enough to be appropriate to be planted on the street. But just imagine the impacts that this tree has had to its ability to anchor itself and stay upright, and the impacts to the likelihood of decay spreading into these cuts is just huge. So there's nothing good that's going to come of this tree's future. And if there was no way to adjust where the concrete was going, then the tree probably just needed to be removed. And that's just a reality. So when construction is going to severely impact some quantity of the root zone of a tree, there are some cases where we just can't have our cake and eat it too. And this is not a Captain Save a Tree moment where we can both have big, beautiful trees in the back and side yard and a brand new garage. If we go back to the diagram of the root system from an earlier slide, it's easy to see how easily 30, 40, 50% of the root system of these trees has been taken away from the excavation of this garage. And we have severely impacted and compromised the tree's ability to just stay upright, not to mention feed its biological processes in the canopy with a sufficient root system below ground. It's also worth mentioning that excavation of this type does not significantly predispose the tree to fall one direction or the other. It is probably more likely for these trees to fail and fall to the right, but it's just as likely that, or I don't want to say just as likely because I don't have research to quantify, but it is also likely that if these trees were to fail at the ground level because of this disturbance, that a rain and windstorm would saturate this soil and allow the tree to actually fall to the left as well. So both are possible, and both of those scenarios get more likely with time as whatever decay might have spread into the cuts on these roots continue to expand and impact root system that wasn't directly impacted by the excavation process itself. So there are a couple options if you manage a campus or a entire city or town, there's going to be construction. It's going to impact trees. We can create a widespread tree ordinance for the campus or for the community that gives general prescriptions for how trees are treated. But what's more effective is a tree preservation plan that is specific to the site that the construction is going to occur on. So tree protection ordinance is much more universal and general, and a tree preservation plan is going to be specific to the project itself, or at least specific to a smaller site than an entire community.
Hey, Graham, there's a question of how long before another tree can be planted if a tree comes down?
If you have the space to plant a tree, then I think that you're in good shape.
Like if it comes down like due to like rot or anything like that, is there a delay time to plant a tree back in the same place?
No, I don't know of any research that shows that decay in an old root system is going to be a threat to a newly planted tree. If anything, the older tree's root system creates a lot of pathways for aeration in the soil, a lot of organic matter as that old root system breaks down. And that's more or less a good thing, unless we have really large roots that are going to create a void that can potentially cause soil to settle into it. And then we're going to need to come in and fill those voids as the soil settles deeper into those root channels that are evacuated with the decay over time.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a tree that you're going to completely uproot, 90% of the root system, there shouldn't be any problem going back in the same hole right away. If you are taking down a very large tree and the stump has to be grounded out, just making sure that the mass majority of that stump has been grounded out. Because like Graham said, I mean, that wood is going to take a while to decay unless it was already starting to decay.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing is that you don't want, when they grind the stump and they make a pile of all the filings and the grinding, do not throw that back into the hole and then plant your tree, because you're going to have a high concentration of carbon and organic matter that as it starts to decay, you're basically creating a hotspot of compost. But if you take those pilings and you spread them out, then you're not creating a high concentration of it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chrissy. Because often it is really convenient to not rake up all those root grindings and just leave them in place and use them to fill the void that you've ground out with the stump grinding itself. But with the idea of either reestablishing turf grass or planting a new tree, in neither of those scenarios is it going to be ideal to have a significant amount of just wood chips basically filling that void. As they break down, they're not going to fill the entire space, and it's going to be a depression. And as Chrissy mentioned, they are going to get hot as they break down, and not only be a problem from that heat and that decomposition energy, but it's also going to bind up soil fertility in that process. And so you have this 1-2 punch of hot composting action, as well as a lack of available nitrogen, because it's all getting dumped into breaking down all this woody tissue. So
last winter we had a bunch of big giant Siberian elms taken down that stood over our house, and we had the stumps grounded, and that's exactly what happened. And my husband so generously went and grabbed a shovel and filled in the holes with the pilings. And of course I came out and I was like, no, what are you doing? So I had to shovel all of it back out, explain to him why. And then we were planning on redoing our whole front lawn. So we just spread all the pilings out on the front lawn. And then before we planted our buffalo grass lawn, we just tilled it all in. And so now we've got that material that's right now, I mean, it's not doing much for the buffalo grass, but down the long run, we have a lot of night crawlers in our front lawn too. So I'm sure they will help break down that material pretty quick.
yeah, definitely. Night crawlers are good at taking that organic matter and breaking it down and pulling it deeper into the soil profile. There are cases up around the Great Lakes in Wisconsin and Minnesota where earthworms are so prolific that they actually take all the organic matter in a forest and they move it deeper into the soil than most plants are able to take advantage, and can actually be a real detriment, even though we typically think of earthworms as being a positive thing in your soils. When they're too prolific and too large in number, and I think it might even be a certain species of earthworm in particular that does this, they actually become a sink for fertility, and they're moving it so deeply into the ground that it's not accessible for the forest community.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, just a little bit of trivia there.
Cool.
So
we just catch them and go fishing.
Yeah, I'm sure that's nice to have a healthy population of night crawlers at your disposal.
Yeah.
Anything else in the chat to mention there?
Nope. Just
Okay.
a few notes about the worms doing their job.
Yeah, definitely.
Mariana does have a good point that if you are aware that your tree has died of verticillium wilt or another transmissible disease, it's good to make sure you can still plant a tree in that same spot, but just know that it's a tree that's not susceptible to verticillium wilt. There's a few that you definitely want to stay away from, like maples.
Yeah, and unless things have changed, verticillium wilt is the only disease that has been shown to be transmitted by infected wood chips from tree work.
Right.
So as a tree service or a manager for trees in a city, if you can identify verticillium wilt as the cause of death in a tree, then it's certainly good practice to sort of isolate the material from that removal rather than reusing it, unless it's going to go down on trails or something that are not likely to impact another tree. Otherwise, I don't know of any other disease that's ever been proven to be moved by that mechanism.
Yep.
And if Mariana does, I'm sure she can weigh in the chat and update a little bit there.
Yep.
For
That's all, Graham.
Yeah, great. So for the tree preservation plan, what's really key, and this is true for all projects, the earlier that we as arborists or landscape designers can get involved in the planning process, the better. But typically what happens is there'll be a big multi-million-dollar project, and the very last part of the budget to be spent and the very last contractor to even be approached about the whole thing is those involved with the landscape around the construction itself. And oftentimes by the time those of us here are brought to the table, a lot of the damage has been done already, because the construction is done and now they're going, hey, by the way, we were kind of thinking that we need some trees in here, and what should we plant? And you're going, well, let's first of all talk about these trees that were already here and what you guys have done. And, you know, just like I've mentioned before, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in these cases. And you can do much more to ensuring the long-term viability of trees by being involved early on and preventing injury and damage and soil compaction, as opposed to trying to come in after the fact and mitigate things that have already happened. So there are a lot of players here, the builders, the developers, the municipal tree board in some cases will have ordinance that they're looking to enforce. The city arborist or forester, the planning staff, the landscaping staff that actually manages the grounds that this construction is being done on. So between these two options, a preservation plan is going to be much more effective at addressing what's going on in a specific construction project. A tree protection ordinance is going to be very difficult to word in a way that will prescribe good practices in every situation that might occur throughout the community. So that doesn't mean that tree protection ordinance isn't good, but it's going to be more general in nature and not prescribed for what's going on with a particular construction project. So the other thing to notice in this diagram here is that we're in many cases going to have to accept some tree loss. And it's much better to define a route for heavy equipment and materials to be moved in and out of the job site and accept some tree loss along that pathway than it is to just sort of either cross our fingers and hope that the contractor doesn't impact the trees much, or allow the contractor to move in and out of the job site wherever they choose. So with a preservation plan for construction, we can define where those pathways are and hold a contractor accountable to using those so that we can isolate the soil compaction and the tree impacts to a specific area that we know is going to occur. So when we're determining which trees we're going to accept the loss of, those decisions are made based on the condition of the trees prior to the construction. There might be a really obvious path that makes sense for everybody involved, where we can get rid of some trees that were already in poor condition and use the location where those trees were as a way in and out of the job site. Maybe we have too many of a particular species on the site, and so some tree loss is going to impact our species diversity on that site more or less than other locations for that pathway. The size of the trees that we're considering having impacts to or taking out entirely.
Graham, is Evelyn skating upstairs?
She is. My daughter is roller skating in the house. It does a real number on our wood floors, but they were in pretty bad shape when we bought the place, so we just accepted that and let her do her thing.
I thought maybe someone else's mic was on, and then it clicked.
Yeah, she's in roller derby, and so she likes to skate around. This isn't an ideal time, so I hope it's not going to be hard for you guys to hear me. So we definitely don't want to bother trying to protect and preserve trees that are already in poor condition. We want to try to keep a good mix of species and age on the site and not concentrate all those impacts on trees that are really young or really old, so that we can keep that age diversity. Some trees are going to be more tolerant to that construction activity than others, and this is a little bit species specific. One book that I'll share with you guys that I didn't put in the PowerPoint itself, Gary Heitschuh. Maybe I'll put this in the chat. This book, oh yeah. First of all, I'll turn off my fancy virtual background for a sec here. This is Gary Heitschuh's book called Native Trees, Shrubs, and Vines for Urban and Rural America. Gary Heitschuh. This is a fantastic book that has not only a lot of good species profiles that get into different attributes of each individual tree, but towards the back, there are appendices. Where are they? I guess they're more towards the front. I haven't opened this in a little while. But it's going to get into specifics on different trees for salt tolerance, air quality tolerance, soil compaction tolerance. And so it's a great resource for trees that are going to be better suited to tolerating construction impacts over time, and which ones are going to be particularly sensitive to whatever impacts from the construction are going to occur. So that's a great resource that I forgot to put in the PowerPoint. I wanted to be sure and share with you guys while I'm thinking about it. Smaller, more vigorous trees may be more tolerant. Again, if we're compacting the ground that the tree is trying to grow into, then that's an issue, but much better to have smaller trees have a little bit tougher go at growing into compacted soil rather than the root loss associated with large mature trees being impacted by that same pathway. So sometimes if we're going to take out a lot of trees around one and just leave one there, the wind throw issue, the compaction, the potential damage to the tree. I mean, we can see up top here a huge branch that's come out of this tree in the past and a large cavity that certainly is extending down through this stem. This is not a tree worth saving, especially a tree like hackberry that's going to be really poor at stopping decay from spreading through it over time. So we just have to be careful about choosing which trees are good candidates for preservation in the first place. So before the project even begins, we can create a map of which trees we're trying to save and define where those tree protection zones are going to be put and where the boundaries for that zone are and what the boundary of that protection zone will be made of. Also details of mitigation and preservation measures. These need to be taken into consideration. And sometimes if you can get involved in the process early enough as a campus grounds manager or an arborist, then these can have impacts and they can change how the grading plan is actually put together in the first place. So rather than asking an architect to go back to the drawing board and change their plans in response to a tree preservation plan, if the plan is put in place early on and communication with the architect can occur early enough, then they can take that into account on the first go around rather than having to revisit their plans and change them. But sometimes it's hard to even get those changes to occur. So your specifications should state what can and cannot be done around the trees and communicate to the contractors the purpose of the barriers and the specific work zones. These specifications are worthless unless you're willing to enforce them. And so you need to have some sort of fine or penalty or something in place that says, this is important to us. We are your customer and we need you to honor this priority that we have for these trees. And the contractor may say, I'm happy to do that. Here are the challenges that I have to getting my job done based on what you've proposed. And in which case, sometimes we can go back to the drawing board on the preservation plan, and there can be a dialogue about give and take between the construction work to be done and the plan itself. Maybe after having a conversation with the general contractor, we're okay with adjusting the preservation plan because there were considerations that weren't being thought of when the preservation plan was put in place. So communication is key with all this. So nothing good's going to come of a tree like this. This is another great case where some well-intentioned folks were trying to save a tree, but rather, as opposed to creating a lot of extra soil and changing the grade upward, we've taken a lot of soil away. It's likely that the original grade for the tree was somewhere kind of around here where we kind of see this dark line. And all the root loss, I mean, this tree has maybe 5% of its root system still in place, if I were to venture a percentage guess. So this tree is going to fall or decline and decay over time, one way or another. Something's going to be the demise of this tree related to the construction. So after the construction work is done, we're not, you know, this is not a tree that we're going to try to mitigate after the fact, and it just needs to come down. But when we do have trees that have been near construction impacts, we can mulch around those trees, develop a watering schedule, not to keep the trees in a boggy mess for the next couple of years, but to avoid the trees in completely bone dry soil as they're trying to recover. Lots of times when we stress trees with damage and soil compaction, they're going to be more prone to nutrient deficiencies and to insect and disease issues because we have taken away a lot of resources. We've stressed them and given them wounds to address with energy that they've stored that they do have still. And so that's going to make them in a compromised state in regard to any sort of insect or disease coming in and trying to get a foothold in the tree. Another thing that can be considered is tree growth regulators. These are hormonal products that are often used by the utility sector, and they're being used a little bit more widely in urban settings to mitigate the tree's response to construction or keep the tree in a good, healthy state when it doesn't have a lot of soil volume to begin with. You can look online at case studies where street trees have been treated with a growth regulator on one side of the street and not the other. And then they've taken an air spade and excavated the root system. And these growth regulators are encouraging the tree to root in the ground with more fine feeder roots and slow down their growth rate above ground in the canopy. And this can be really beneficial for trees that are in a really tight spaces and are going to reach a mature size that's problematic if something isn't done. And so growth regulators like Cambistat are a valid consideration when we have a tree that is stressed by construction impacts as well. Ideally, we would just want one way on and off the property for contractors to bring materials and equipment. It's important to identify where contractors should be parking their personal vehicles and defining where equipment and fill, dirt, and that sort of thing can be staged until it's going to be actually put in place permanently. And those cement washout pits are another good thing to identify a location for. That will have impacts on the pH of the soil around that area where they wash out the concrete trucks. And oftentimes there's going to be construction debris concentrated in an area. And it's just a lot easier to have all that go in one location and then scooped up later and taken care of. So this is often the kind of thing that happens. Tree protection zones can list some of these, or signs can list the prohibitions and that sort of thing that you might have in place. So that critical root zone goes to the drip line of the tree. And as we saw, there's plenty of roots beyond the drip line, but if we can keep the impacts for that critical root zone under the drip line to a minimum or not at all, then we've really done a lot of the work to keeping that tree from having any significant problems. This can be done with a number of different materials. These are slides from Peru State College where the former grounds manager had established some tree protection zones with 40-foot radius for the trees. Peru State College has the Oak Bowl that is around their sports stadium. And it's a remnant population of bur oaks that were there before the university. As we mentioned, oaks are one of the trees that really don't like that soil disturbance. And so Rick was trying to do his best to protect those trees. And the contractor decided that they would determine where that tree protection zone would be, took all of his snow fence down and just wrapped it around the trunk of the tree. And then as an additional screw you to Rick, started to pile retaining wall block and that sort of thing right up against the tree itself. So this gets back to the idea of where enforcement and communication with the contractor is really key, so that those priorities are conveyed to the contractor, and then the contractor can be sure that that communication continues down the line to all the subs. So you can do more of a wooden structure that yahoos are not going to be able to easily take down snow fence and change where that is. There's all kinds of different approaches to this that use different materials. And so if you have a really good relationship with the contractor and you're confident that he or she and their subs are going to honor the tree protection zones, then you may not have to be as aggressive with what sort of materials are used to define those protection zones. So you can calculate your root zone radius by trunk diameter. I don't think that there's going to be any questions about that on the exam, but we'll go through the questions here shortly when we wrap up. So when you have to lower the grade, sometimes you can put treat islands in place with retaining walls that will preserve the grade for, in and around the tree if we don't have to change the grade within that critical root zone. But if you're bringing that excavation too close to the tree, then you're going to want to more strongly consider just removal of the tree entirely. When you have to raise the grade of the tree to some degree of effectiveness, you can use pits to preserve that existing grade around the tree. The wider those pits can be, the more effective that they're going to be, but they're also going to be impacted by how much fill is going to go outside of that pit. And here's a link to another good resource from University of Minnesota Extension on construction damage. So we see this kind of thing all the time. If it's done after the fact on a mature tree, there's potential for decay to spread into the stem of the tree and all kinds of other issues. So it's good to avoid this sort of thing if you can, but you can't throw a rock on Pinterest or other social media platforms without hitting some post of somebody suggesting how cute this sort of thing can be. And wherever you can, if you do have to change the grade in this way, it's better to step it down with multiple retaining walls rather than doing it all in one shot with one really tall wall. So keep any trenching work outside the drip line. Keep roots moist when they're exposed until the backfill comes back on as best you can. Make sharp cuts if you can, rather than pinching off roots with equipment or making really ragged and jagged cuts like you would with a stump grinder. I mentioned this point already, and here's another link to that same Florida study on urban sidewalks. Another thing that can be done is you can use an air spade to create that trench and minimize or eliminate any root loss that occurs. So rather than taking a trencher and cutting every single root that from the soil surface down to the bottom of the trench, you can use compressed air to blow that dirt out and sometimes install utilities without severely impacting the roots that are growing across that trench. So this is a much more invasive approach that has cut every single root in its path. So if we're excavating with air, then I don't know why they put this right below the trunk of the tree. That would be pretty challenging. I guess with horizontal boring, you could do something this way. But if we had a trench like this to put in place with compressed air, we could do that without cutting all the roots that were in its path. So different equipment, it's going to produce different types of cuts, and they're going to have different degrees of desirability for how the root system responds to it. So with tunneling, boring, or air spading, we can minimize that root impact and still get the trench that we need put where it goes. So root loss can compromise stability. We talked about that a little bit earlier with the garage that was being put in. Not much more to say there. If we have wounds to trees, we certainly don't want to respond to that damage with a lot of synthetic fertilizer. That's just going to stimulate a lot of growth and take the tree out of the driver's seat in how it allocates energy to that damage. This is a project at Henry Dorley Zoo from years ago, photos that I inherited from somebody else. So I don't have a lot of background, and I don't think these trees were still there, but this PVC pipe has holes drilled in it at regular intervals and was designed to facilitate gas exchange for that root system when they came through with a lot of fill over this site. So at the zoo, having a lot of shade and forage for, I think this is by there where the elephants used to be. And it was important that they preserve this tree, but for whatever reason, they had a lot of fill that they needed to bring in. And so they were doing what they could to get as much life out of the tree as they could before it has issues with the stress from all that extra fill put in. So with a lot of gravel without fines, they put that in around there and then created sort of a pit that keeps the existing grade around the base of the tree preserved, but a lot of extra fill around it. So this is certainly going to be a problem for the tree, even with a pit like this. But in a situation where, like the zoo, where you really want to keep that tree around as long as possible, sometimes it's worth it to try to do something like that. These are my parents' bur oaks. They have pits around the base because as the road was expanded up here by their house, then this slope got steeper. And so the grade around the base of the trees had to get raised in order to keep that from being a really steep and unmanageable slope. And so those bur oaks are starting to show signs. This is another photo point that I need to revisit so we could compare this photo on the left to how the canopies are looking now. They're still doing fairly good, but we're all expecting that they are going to have ongoing stress over time from this grade change. It's also worth noting that insect and disease pressure is going to be a problem after the construction. When you compact the soil around a construction site, then water is going to hold in that soil for longer. Things like arborvitae, or not arborvitae, what do we have here? These Alberta spruce, they really don't like having wet feet all the time. Things like scale and needle drop are going to be more of a problem for them after that compaction. So watch for new insect and disease problems in trees after they've had these construction impacts. And finally, here's another great list of resources for more information. These two books on the right side are both excellent, as well as all the links that I put in there. So anything in the chat, Chrissy?
Other than the common, okay, wait, hold on, sorry. For the zoo photo, if that was the original grade, it looks like the tree was planted too deep, not the root flare at all.
Yeah, possibly. But the tree is big and providing a lot of benefits. So regardless of whether it was deep in the ground already, they still felt it was worthwhile to spend the money and the time to try to limp it along as long as possible. But good observation.
And it says, like Jack Phillips said, trees don't die when you kill them.
Yeah, trees don't die when they're killed. They're tenacious organisms. They're going to take a long time to decline and circle the drain. There are very few things that will kill a tree quickly, especially if they're well established. So when that tree was planted too deep, that could be your definition of when the tree was killed. It just takes a long time for those processes to happen. Good point. So with the, we got about 20 minutes left here, so we might as well go through the chapter questions. And I'm going to get back to asking those of you attending to go through these with us and chime in with some answers. So what are some different ways that trees can be negatively impacted by construction? And maybe if you want to unmute yourself, tell us one or two of those. Especially if you haven't answered yet, but we're glad to hear from Kent and Mariana and others of you that have already chimed in. We've reviewed a lot of them. What are some problems with trees in construction?
Compaction.
Michael, what'd you say?
Said soil compaction and exposure to the elements.
Yeah, excellent. There's somebody
Philip, I
else?
see you're unmuted.
Grade change and injuries.
Yeah, yep, definitely. The book lists root injury, soil compaction, physical injury to the trunk or the branches, grade change, excavation and severing of the root system. So you know, some of these are, you know, is root injury different than excavation and severing of the root system? Yeah, I suppose. You know, it'd be easy to lump those together, but just be able to list a number of these for the exam. When soil is compacted, the pore space between soil particles is reduced. We talked about that a little bit. How about somebody tell me a little bit about the phases of land development? There are some distinct ones that the book talks about. How about what's the first thing that we're doing when we're planning some land development? Oh.
Planning.
Yeah, I guess I said it there, didn't I? Yeah, the planning phase itself before anything has actually been done. How about step 2?
Design.
Right. So then we're the contractor's putting together the documents that define what's to be done. Then usually there is some earthwork to be done, the construction itself. And then of course, the last phase of this land development is where we're coming back and maintaining what the changes that have been done. And this is where we're kind of mitigating anything that we couldn't prevent in the first place. Number 4, the soil grade on a construction site is blank. A large percentage of a tree's root system might be removed. If the grade is blank, the tree's roots might be suffocated. So if the soil grade on a construction site is lowered, a large percentage of the root system might be removed because we're taking soil away and taking the roots with it, because we can't leave roots in place that are above the new grade. So this is more of an issue with removal rather than adding soil. If the grade is raised, that's where the suffocation and the impacts to gas exchange occur. Number 5, what can we use? A technique used to reduce soil compaction around trees on the site is to spread a temporary thick layer of mulch, right? How about number 6, true or false? The overriding objective of an arborist involved in a development project is to save every tree on the site.
False.
Right. So aside from that being a pretty easy question to answer, anytime you see a true false question that has equivocal statements like every or all or never, things like that, it's more likely that that's going to be a false answer if you had to take a guess because you're not really sure about what the right answer is. So next one, true or false, is it better to tunnel directly under a tree than to cut directly across the root system of the tree when excavating for utility lines?
True.
Yeah, that is true. And it seems like right under the middle of the tree might be more problematic and more likely to disturb roots. But often this is also exactly where the utility wants. If we're talking about street trees, they're going to want to put those utility lines right through the middle of the turf space rather than close to the sidewalk or close to the street. So it's kind of a win-win for the tree and the utility line. An important action that should be taken at the start of a construction project is to erect blank around all the trees that are to remain. What is that? The book says fences or barriers. We can call that a tree protection zone barrier. There's lots of terminology that you can use to make that point, but the book is going to call that a barrier. Number 9, true or false, the largest, most mature trees are not always the best candidates for preservation.
True.
True. Just because it's big and mature doesn't mean that it's in good condition. It doesn't mean it's desirable for other reasons. It may be right in the middle of where the excavation is going to go. So do we really want to alter the footprint of the construction just to accommodate a tree because it's big? Not always. 10, true or false, there's far more than an arborist can do to treat trees that have been damaged by construction than to prevent the damage. True or false? That is false. There's definitely a lot more prevention, and that's going to be much more effective than trying to mitigate effects that have already occurred to the trees after the construction. True or false, evaluating suitability of individual trees or stands for preservation is one of the most important tasks for the arborist. That is true. It's very important that we evaluate individual trees and the stands on the front end for that suitability so that we can make good choices about which trees we're choosing to protect and preserve and which ones we're allowing to be either removed ahead of time or impacted. 12, written specifications should detail exactly what can and cannot be done to and around the trees. Specifications is the answer there. Number 13, use of an blank blank has proven effective for soil aeration and radial trenching, causing much less root injury than mechanical excavation equipment. What is that?
Air spade.
Yeah, that's the air spade or an air excavator. I think air spade might be a trade name for a particular product, but an air excavator would be the more all-encompassing term, kind of like tissue versus Kleenex, right? We call it all Kleenex, but it's not all Kleenex brand tissue, but it's just kind of the term that we use. 14. The blank 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 is the area around the tree or groups of trees in which no grading, excavation, or construction activity is to occur. That, of course, is the tree protection zone. And then 15, sometimes the single blank blank established to limit traffic on the site can later serve as the route for utility wires, water lines, the driveway, or other paved surfaces. What is that?
Access road.
Yeah, very good, very good. So challenge questions, these are ones that the book does not provide an answer for, that are for reflection. And so these will be good ones for us to end with. Write a sample set of specifications. So that's just asking you to think through how you might write specifications for a tree protection plan. And plenty of dialogue we could have on that in its own presentation. What actions can be taken if a tree is damaged by construction in violation of the written specifications? So we've established our protection zones, we've given specifications to the contractor, and then they do something else anyways against what we sort of identified as the spec. So what can we do if that tree is damaged by construction outside of the specifications? What are some different possibilities?
Fines are typically written in said specifications.
Right. And sometimes the specifications can call for termination of a contract. I don't know how frequently that happens, but a contractor can potentially be fired from the job if they're in significant violation of a specification. And again, this comes back to the willingness of the client to enforce those specs. Kent, do you have any stories to share on that, or anybody else on grievous practices that you had to, bring the hammer down on one way or another or deal with?
I guess I would add that you might write into the contract, at least when it's being bid, that the contractor has to provide a performance bond or some other kind of a bond that basically sits there until the project is closed out. And then instead of issuing a fine per se, yeah, you have that performance bond. And maybe I'm using the wrong term for the bond, but
Yeah.
it allows you to basically retain some insurance money there
Right.
for if they do something. I guess one of the instances that I had was not necessarily with construction, but with just pruning, where the contractor that I'd hired didn't follow instructions and ended up limbing up a tree. Of course, it's really hard to put branches back on again. And so basically I said, well, here's the deal. You just did that work for free. And then, I negotiated some additional work where I had some trees that were going to be subject to the 2-inch above the ground cut, and figuring that, well, this guy knows how to use a chainsaw, so we'll use him for removals. So that's basically what I do now. That particular contractor is no longer eligible to do any tree work for me, where it's pruning work. I'll use them for removals, but that's about it.
Certainly. Yeah. Your point about the bond kind of reminds me of like a security deposit. If you were to be renting a duplex or apartment or something like that, it's sort of a money you'll get back as long as everything goes okay. Thanks for sharing that, Kent. Why may tree death and decline due to construction occur several years after construction is completed? As Mariana mentioned, that saying that Jack Phillips coined is so relevant here. Trees rarely die right away after the construction is done. Often those stress factors are going to be at play for a number of years. It's going to take the tree a long time to either decline from that damage further, or in some cases actually regroup, continue to grow new root system, and try to get things established in order to continue to move forward. So what are some signs that you can see of that construction damage if you're looking for it after the construction's done? What can be going on in the tree that tells us that they've had some impacts? I mean, physical damage to the trunk's an obvious one, but what else could we look for?
Canopy decline.
Right, and what would that look like, Mariana?
Well, you get less branching, you get small branches dying at the beginning.
Right. Sometimes the next year's leaves will be smaller and stunted and maybe discolored as the tree is really struggling to keep all that foliage alive. And so, yeah, any kind of decline. And this is where, just like I tell homeowners a lot that have a question about whether a tree's doing okay, taking photos before construction is invaluable sometimes, so that you can refer back to the state that tree was in prior to construction. It's not realistic to hold a contractor accountable for that tree looking just like it did before, but usually if there's some suspected impacts, then photos from before the construction occurred can sort of validate those concerns, or at least point to the likelihood that their actions were at play in the decline of the tree.
You might see chlorosis too. That's
Yeah.
bleeding.
Right. The leaves can be smaller in size, or getting yellow and discolored, and that can definitely be a sign. So that's what I've got for you guys. There are a couple more challenge questions if we want to go over them. For now, if you would get your CEU information into the chat for me, and I'll take a look here and see if anybody had some text for me to point out. Yeah, pest infestation, insect and disease problems on trees from stress is definitely going to be something to look for. This is where your experience as a property manager is really valuable, if you've been managing that property for a number of years, you know what trees have been struggling with what different problems over time. And so you'll be more cognizant of some new problem that might pop up after construction. Deanna had a developer who came back and donated dollars to plant new trees. Yeah. So sometimes they will do that sort of thing just to stay in good graces with the client. This is where you can really leverage your influence at the municipal level. There's definitely going to be more work to be done for the city. So contractors, if they're held to account and specifications are enforced, they will be very willing to follow those specs in order to ensure that they have the opportunity to get future work. Anything I didn't cover? Any questions on that chapter that we haven't hit on? I'm actually kind of surprised that I had 90 minutes worth of content there. It's good conversation, and so I like bringing you guys in to dialogue on this stuff, because there's we all have experience that's valuable to share. Any last minute thoughts? Yeah, Chrissy.
I went ahead and put Graham and I's email in the chat. Again, if you have not started your application, please reach out to us so we can get you going and be ready for that financial assistance opportunity when it's there.
Yeah, Lance, I will, what I'll do, maybe I'll take all these links. Would it be preferable to get an email with all the links that I had in the PowerPoint, or I can at least get a PDF to you of the slides? That'll be available. So, but then you have to type it all back in again.
Yeah, whatever's easiest for you. I just didn't know if you had that original resource page that I thought maybe there's a resource page that had all the slides or all the presentations on it all in one page, or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll get it to you guys one way or another. And there were
Sure.
a couple of links on other slides that I can kind of get all those compiled together and shoot out an email to everybody with those.
Okay.
Get to them quick.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
email just
point.
froze up. Otherwise, I would have put it in the chat. I'll make sure that I send that back out again. It is, if you search your email from the Nebraska Forest Service, you might find it from when I first sent it out, but we will send it out again so that way everybody has it.
Yeah. Awesome.
And again, just to remind everyone that those playbacks or those recordings of our sessions will be available until the end of March. So March 31, they will no longer be available. So.
Yep. So thanks everybody for their time and joining us today. It's good to connect with all you guys. We'll hopefully be able to get back to some in-person meetings at some point here as the vaccinations continue to move forward and university adjusts their protocol for what we can do for work. So yeah, thanks everybody. We'll sit tight here a bit if there's any other CEU information you need to get in. I think the usual suspects already have them entered. So thanks for joining us.
See you next Tuesday.
Yeah.